Is there a place and time where logic breaks down and wonderment begins? Could that be somewhere or sometime along an indefinable line between the reasonable and the highly unlikely? Join us on a journey into the improbable.
Today's story, episode 233, The House of Veracity, read by Mitchell 2. Opening and closing themes by Matthew Erdman. Somewhere and sometime, there may be a hidden cost for help. Imara knocked impatiently on the door at number 857. The bell was out of order, although its electric eye still glowed at her in forest green, indicating the occupant was present. She tried again and waited a few minutes before pulling out her handheld to text Matteo Costa, the errant son of two lifelong members who she was there to meet. "This is Custodian Imara from the House of Veracity. I'm outside, but you are not answering." She heard fumbling and something drop behind the door. Then unsure footsteps approached. Finally, the latch clicked, and the door tentatively swung open as far as the guard chain would allow. She could see an eye attempting to scrutinize her, so she held up the lanyard with her House of Veracity ID. The door slammed, then opened, revealing a handsome, obviously enhanced man in his early 30s, dressed in a wrinkled housecoat. She could tell from the stale smell wafting into the hall he hadn't been outside for a long time. Sorry. Come in. I must not have heard you. I've been a bit distracted." He apologized, squinting to check the hall in both directions before letting Imara in. She noted the condo had been a luxury unit maybe 10 years ago, but recent neglect made it feel run down and out of place in the upscale building. However, it fit the pattern of obsession, inevitable downfall, and finally, desperation, which eventually led people back to the house. It didn't bother Imara. She had expected a situation like this. After all, a custodian's purpose was to help in times of need, and there was a lot of need these days. Matteo led her down a short hallway to a living area with large windows looking out to a balcony and another condo tower across the street. "Please, sit down." He motioned her to a designer leather chair next to a trendy glass-topped coffee table whose edges had been covered in bright, fluorescent orange tape. She settled in and took out her handheld, noting how other bits of furniture and the appliances on the kitchen island were likewise tagged with bright tape and large labels. Matteo had obviously waited as long as he possibly could before he had asked for the house's intervention. "Thank you for letting us assist," she said out of habit, opened a file on her handheld and scanned it for the family photo. She could see a vague resemblance to the toddler and proud parents who peeked out at her from a decades-old image and could already guess the scenario. As a young teen, Matteo would have rebelled against his parents and the house's wisdom. Propelled by the desperate need to fit in and peer pressure, he would have started secretly buying cheap online DNA mods. They would have been things which would not have been too obvious at first. He would grow taller than his other family members. He would become more muscled and leaner than his DNA and lack of exercise could account for. Then maybe a small tweak to the nose or chin or teeth, and by the time his parents realized what was going on, he would have been well on his way and addicted like so many others. Imara had the house's AI age the photo of the toddler, then frowned, comparing it to the man sitting across from her. His changes had been more extensive than most. Nonetheless, the House of Veracity was patient and waited for those wayward souls to return to the way, Once they finally realized, as most eventually did, they had gone too far and were now paying the price for their hubris belief they could be better than nature's intended plan. No in vitro manipulation, Imara noted with satisfaction. That's good, and I see your parents brought you to us when you were 6 weeks old, and then again at a year, so we have good quality samples. You're lucky. Many parents choose characteristics in vitro, so there is no unaltered DNA to work with. I've checked with the repository, and your samples are in excellent shape. I know there have been rumors about an attack on our facilities, where power was cut off for several days, but those are not true. The House would never let anything like that happen. After all, protection of our biological heritage is our central purpose. Your parents understood that and enrolled you in the program. Now, I'm not here to proselytize or make you feel bad about your choices. The House does not judge. We know this moment comes for many who have drifted from the path. Before we go any further, I just need a few details about your modification history. Matteo stumbled. I guess I was expecting you'd bring the samples and a kit with you or something. If you read the materials we sent, you would know that's not how we work, Custodian Amara explained, trying to keep her impatience out of her voice. She had 3 more appointments that day, and if they all started like this one, it would be a long day indeed. It's for our records. We keep a database of the modifications our errant flock make, so we can track how far humanity is drifting from the purity of the baseline. Oh, Matteo grunted. Do you need everything? Some of it's very personal. His reaction was not uncommon. She knew people felt it was an invasion of their privacy. However, she wasn't about to let that get in her way. Artificial enhancements can get passed on to the next generation. Did you know that, Mr. Costa? She hated that most of the enhanced were oblivious to the fact their personal choices could outlive them. In a few generations, there will not be any baseline humans left. As I've mentioned, it's the House's mission to preserve our natural genetic heritage. We don't believe we are wise enough to design our biological future. Matteo shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I never thought of it that way. Few do, Mr. Costa. She was tempted to lecture this sorry example on the dangers of wholesale personal genetic manipulation. However, that was not a custodian's role. Let's start with why you contacted the House, she suggested instead. It's my eyes, he finally admitted, although she had guessed that from the fluorescent tape, large labels, and the way the man felt his way around the condo. It was also why he hadn't been outside recently. He was almost blind, but in denial about it. It's something to do with degeneration of the cones in my eyes, Matteo began to explain. The doctors say there's nothing they can do. It started a few weeks after I had an upgrade to improve my memory. And where did you get this modification? Imara asked, already knowing the answer. Everyone at work had it done. Look, he pleaded, trying to gain her sympathy. It was getting hard to keep up with them. They all had eidetic memories, could recall any fact in a meeting. I was getting left behind. I would have lost my job. A colleague told me about a lab online that was doing the same type of modifications, ones I could at least afford. You felt you didn't have a choice and couldn't turn down the opportunity, Imara suggested. Yeah, that's right. Thanks for understanding. Imara left his assumption about her understanding hanging unconfirmed in the air for a few seconds before continuing. You know, those types of companies keep their costs down by offering questionable generic ACGT nucleotides, which don't take into account your other modifications. She shook her head in mock disgust. You used a self-modification kit too, didn't you? She asked, rhetorically, knowing this part of his story. Matteo nodded sheepishly. That's how they protect themselves, she explained. The end user makes the final choice. That way they can claim you accepted all the risk. So if something goes wrong, you're 100% responsible. I'm sure if you check their documentation closely, there will be a clause where they recommend only using their product if you have no other modifications. I know that now, Matteo admitted, looking away. Without proper modeling, Imara reminded him, there is no way to predict what other changes a patch, especially a generic one, will cause. Even with the best custom-designed enhancements, there is always a risk. She put her handheld down and leaned forward. Nature always keeps close to the center line, Mr. Costa. Outliers usually don't survive to reproduce. You were brought up to know this. Matteo squirmed again in his seat, like a kid who had been called to the principal's office for misbehaving. Custodian Imara watched, letting the awkward silence continue a bit too long. She knew from experience this was the moment when the wayward either reconsidered the costs of their capricious behavior or stubbornly insisted on denying the facts. As I mentioned, before we go any further, we need your history. She smiled, picked up her handheld again, opened a new file, and waited. Matteo hesitated, then seemed to give in. Okay. Where should I start? With the most recent modification, then work back, Imara advised. At this point, I only need the major ones. We will require a full inventory before the procedure, which you can send after this interview. I don't suppose you kept a sample of the memory enhancement. No, and I can't contact them. They seem to have disappeared, Matteo confessed, his face flush with embarrassment. Probably a ghost lab, Imara suggested. They pop up to sell generics for the current most popular mod, and when something goes wrong, they conveniently fade away, move, and do it all again under another name. You'll never find them, Mr. Costa. Now, let's move on, she urged. It's not the first time I used a generic, so I guess I wasn't worried, Matteo admitted. By the time I was 16, I realized I wasn't going to grow as tall as my friends. I guess that's where it started. I worked part-time and saved for a height patch, one that would keep the growth plates in my bones from fusing until I was 20. It was something subtle and simple. I couldn't afford a personally tailored version, plus I knew my parents would never agree to it. So I bought a black market generic kit and it worked. I got an extra 6 inches, made me a bit above average for my peer group, and helped me get noticed. After I moved out and got a full-time job, I bought a tailored mod to increase strength and endurance. Then I started to experiment with other small changes like hair and nose, eye color, the tweaks most people do. Those were all tailored, but they were common enough so they weren't expensive. It's the new stuff, the brain alterations, like memory enhancement or intelligence, which are finally out of reach for most people. But people are somehow getting them anyway, and that changes the playing field for the rest of us. You can't compete for jobs without those enhancements, so you're forced to turn to the black market or generics. You're not out there, so you don't understand the pressure people like me are under. Almost everyone in my generation was enhanced in vitro. Holdouts like my parents, he grumbled, put me at a disadvantage from the moment I was born. I've been playing catch-up all my life, and it's caused friction with my family. We lost touch over the years. They would be horrified by what I've had to do to survive. The world is pretty black and white for them. There is no middle ground, Custodian Imara. Matteo gave her an accusatory stare. That is the way the house sees things, isn't it? Completely binary? Well, when I moved on with the rest of the world, that rigid way of thinking ended my relationship with my family. I didn't have a choice unless I wanted to live on social assistance or work for you. No offense, but I've never seen a job posting for paying positions in the house. Well, I'm sorry you see things that way. Your parents had your best interests in mind, Mr. Costa. They wanted you to have a healthy life. Maybe so, but as I said, the world has moved on, and I have too. You are dabbling in something we don't completely understand, Mr. Costa, Imara interrupted and explained in a distracted tone as she made another note in her files. She looked up. We are not as black and white as you make us out to be. We support the use of synthetic DNA in the service of curing disease, just not cosmetic alterations. I don't need the lecture, Custodian Amara, Matteo complained. I heard it almost every day while I was growing up. Look, I want to fix my eyes, stop their cones from dying. Can you just restore my eyesight? Imara shook her head. We are not a medical clinic, Mr. Costa. As I've already stated, the House of Veracity's mission is to ensure baseline humanity does not disappear. If you accept our gift, you will be returned to the way nature intended you to be. Okay then, can I just get a small sample? He asked, getting impatient. You can keep the rest. I'll sign it over to you for research or whatever. I'm sure I can find someone else to do the work. You've no right to deny me access to my own DNA. I've checked on that, he threatened. Imara sighed. We are not denying you access to anything, but you must use our clinic. There is no charge. The house provides the procedure for free. Except you only offer one treatment, a reset to the original DNA, which wipes out all enhancements, Matteo pointed out angrily. Up to now, it has more than sufficed to further our mission, Imara retorted. We see no need for anything else. There have been many legal challenges, as I assume you know. They have all failed because we are not withholding anything from you. Samples are intended to last millennia and must be decanted using a House of Veracity proprietary process, and that process only works as a complete reset. You or your parents could have chosen to keep samples of your natural DNA anywhere you wanted. The choice is yours, Mr. Costa. You can go elsewhere and use other samples you may have had the foresight to have stored. How convenient, Matteo swore under his breath. You know there are no other samples. Unless you're rich, the storage costs are prohibitive. Only the house does it for free. He ran a hand through his perfect hair, then glared at Imara. I wasn't willing to accept the narrow limitations of the house when I was young, and I'm not willing to accept them now. I think it's time you left, Custodian. Imara calmly shut down her handheld, placed it back into her briefcase, and stood up. You have my contact information should you change your mind, Mr. Costa. I have many other appointments today, so I'll be on my way. I can find my own way out. Imara turned and left, confident she would hear from Matteo again. Custodian Imara was surprised Matteo Costa had held out longer than most. He tried several unsuccessful black market hacks to restore his vision. None had worked, and one had actually accelerated his vision loss, and now he was sitting across from her at one of the house's clinics, looking defeated. Have you learned to accept who nature intended you to be, not what you've modified yourself to become? Further, do you agree to abstain from future modifications? Imara asked the question as a matter of form. He did not have to verbally confirm. By placing his thumbprint on the consent form, Matteo had already agreed to the terms. Matteo nodded almost imperceptibly. Yes, he whispered grudgingly. Imara helped the crushed man get up from his seat and steered him down the short hallway from the waiting area to the restoration room. She helped him feel his way to the operating table and get up on it, and then left to attend to another returning member. How is your eyesight? Custodian Imara asked, noting the bright tape and labels had been removed from the furniture. It had been 6 weeks since Matteo's restoration. Getting better, he grudgingly admitted, looking out the sliding glass doors of his condo at a pigeon which had decided to rest on the balcony's rail before flying off in search of its next meal. He turned away to face Imara. I have 75% now, and the doctors tell me I should recover, at least to where my unenhanced eyes would have been, he grumbled. Corrective lenses or contacts are an option, Imara suggested. Although they are hard to get these days, the house has its own sources. I'm sure the house does, but can the house find me a new job? One which doesn't require enhancements? Matteo groused. You can see again. Isn't that enough, Mr. Costa? Matteo turned back and looked out the window. The pigeon had flown away. So what if I enhance myself to get a job? Remember the commitment you made, Mr. Costa, Imara patiently reminded him. So sue me, he angrily shot back, suddenly rounding on the custodian. I'll do what I need to get my life back to the way it was. That won't happen, Imara stated, with the confidence of one with inside knowledge. People who return stay on the path. No one has ever gone back. Really? He questioned incredulously. Well, I'm going to be the first. I can assure you that will never happen. I find that hard to believe, Matteo challenged. It's not a matter of belief, Mr. Costa. The house is too practical for that. It's coded into your DNA. It's the only non-medical modification the house has ever endorsed and ever will. I don't understand. I don't understand what you are implying. Matteo's voice shook with frustration. You can't modify your genes anymore, Custodian Imara informed him in a clipped, professional tone. Any changes will be rejected. She smiled slyly and dropped a contract on Matteo's coffee table. It's in the fine print, Mr. Costa. Read it at your leisure. Oh, and one other thing, off the record, of course. The generic memory enhancement, which caused your blindness and convinced you to come back into the fold? Yeah, Matteo snorted indignantly, still processing what he had just been told. What about it? We have had a 100% success rate since deploying it. Everyone who has used that mod returned to the house. Welcome back, Matteo. Now, I must get going. With the satisfaction of a job well done, Custodian Imara got up to move on to her next case. Makeshift Stories is a proud member of the Alberta Podcast Network, locally grown, community supported. To get other great APN podcasts, head over to albertapodcastnetwork.com, where you'll find I Love This, You Should Too. Join Matt Bowes and Aaron Fraser as they explore the world of Hindi cinema through the lens of two Canadian cinephiles. This episode of Makeshift Stories is brought to you by Roomy. Cold drafts, flickering lights, and where's that leak coming from? If you've ever wondered what's really going on in your home, Roomy's Ask a Home Inspector service can help. Connect with a certified professional home inspector by phone or video call and get your questions answered. Roomy will let you know what's easily fixable with a little DIY, or when you might need to call in some professional help. Visit roomy.ca, that's RUMI.ca, and book your Ask a Home Inspector appointment today. This episode of Makeshift Stories is brought to you by the Alberta Podcast Network. APN connects Alberta podcast listeners to businesses and organizations in Alberta and around the world. Podcasters in our network are smart, creative, and engaging, providing an excellent way to reach local listeners and those around the world who enjoy our shows. Send us an email at hello@albertapodcastnetwork.com and we'll help you meet your goals. Makeshift Stories is released around the beginning and the middle of the month. This month's story was written by Alan V. Hare and read by Mitchell Tu. Opening and closing themes were composed and recorded by Matthew Erdman. If you'd like to connect with us, please send an email to makeshiftstories@gmail.com or visit our website at makeshiftstories.com. Links to both are in the show notes. You can help us out by getting your friends to subscribe or follow wherever they listen to audio. Makeshift Stories is released under a Creative Commons non-commercial attribution no derivative license, which means you are free to share our stories. Just remember to credit us and don't alter anything.